Hey! As well as making an extra lesson in the beginner's course covering the new audio editing features and 1 or 2 new devices, I thought I'd make a new module on the advanced course too, showing you some of the new features on Reason's mixer. I've created a simple house groove with which to demonstrate these. Just to give you a quick rundown of the session, the drums are being made largely with 2 instances of Kong. One containing the main drums, which I've taken from Reason's new Deep House kit, and the other triggering sounds in a kit from Loopmaster's Audio Jack sample pack. Then, Octo-Rex is playing a couple of flanged drums throughout the break to add some extra colour and width. You can hear it's quite light and chirpy sounding at the minute. All the drums have been routed out onto their own mixer channels, as I showed you earlier on the course, which is typically how I prefer to do things, so it makes them easier to mix. And I've also used Spider to split the kick signal, which I'm then routing to the sidechain input on the 2 main instruments in the track, which I've put in a separate rack here. I'm sure you're properly familiarised with sidechain compression by now, but remember, this is to create more dynamic movement and rhythmic interest, especially in the bass line, which would otherwise be just sustained notes. This not only helps add extra excitement, but also ensures the kick isn't masked and punches nicely through the mix. Just to play you these instruments then, I've got the main synth part coming out of Subtractor, which I've set up with a couple of digital waveforms. If I just turn off oscillator 2 for a minute and then raise the cutoff, then you'll be able to hear what's going on a bit more easily. On the clip in the arrangement, I've got a nice repeating pattern of 4 chords, lasting a dotted crotchet or a beat and a half each. All minor 7th chords, with the root note on the bottom. So we're going G down to D, then A down to E. So stepping down a 4th each time. Then we've got another 4th interval on top, playing the 7th and minor 3rd notes in the chord. So as the chord steps down a 4th, you get a note continuing into the next chord, which helps the harmony flow nicely. First it's the F here, which changes from the 7th in G to the minor 3rd in D, and then it's the A in the next section. Back on Subtractor then, what I've got is the other oscillator transposed up a 5th. So this is actually very similar to the bonus module on the beginner's course. Only there it was the other way around, where the synth was playing the minor chord and I was playing a 5th interval in the MIDI clip. However, the result is the same, where you get a much jazzier and more interesting sound created by the extra intervals. I've used the mix style to turn oscillator 2 down a bit, so the dominant chord is that in the MIDI clip being played by oscillator 1. If I lower the filter frequency down now, you can hear I've got that being modulated up and down by the LFO, to create a nice rhythmic effect. And then Matrix underneath is modulating the cutoff on top, to add a bit more subtle variation. So we've got the stacked modulation effect going on there. Again, these are things you should be well aware of now, as they're all covered earlier on the course. And then the bass is simply a sine wave coming out of Maelstrom, playing the root notes of the chord down an octave to add some bottom end. Then, Thor is playing a repeating, arpeggiated type phrase, with the notes F, G and D cycling with a nice rhythmic pattern of alternating quavers and semiquavers. These notes are the 7th, root and 5th in G, where the song begins, and then the 6th, 7th and 4th in A, where the song modulates. However, I think the overriding key is G throughout the whole phrase, even though the harmony modulates up to A. And this arpeggiated part emphasises that. You can hear this if you hum a G over the top of the whole song, because it doesn't sound bad. And plus, in my opinion, it's often better to have the simplest bass line you can in a house track, so if you can stay on one note, then do so, especially if the harmony is shifting around on top. To demonstrate this, I've got a very deep sub-bass part being played by Octo Rex on the end, which is going to add the fatness right at the bottom. If I transpose it up an octave for a second, and then add Maelstrom over the top, you can hear it works. Then I'll transpose it back down and add the other parts in, and you can hear, as long as you have decent speakers connected, that you don't get any clashes. I've also made a few adjustments to the EQ on some tracks, which is one of the new features in Reason 7, namely the addition of an editable graphic display. This is a very welcome new feature, and makes mixing a lot easier. Plus, it's very well implemented. If I just solo the kick first, and show you on that track, you can see above the EQ section on the channel strip, there's now a graphic EQ button, which you can click to make the graphic display pop up for that channel. A shortcut to this is the F2 key. This shows you the signal on a spectrum analyzer, and then allows you to edit the EQ curve on top, which is much easier than simply relying on your ears and using the knobs on the desk. Down the right side, you have buttons for turning the filters and EQ on and off. So if I wanted to quickly add a low pass to roll off the top end, then I just turn that filter on and then drag the cutoff down. Similarly, the EQ can be turned on and off with the switch, and then each of the 4 bands dragged around to cut or boost different frequencies. When adjusting either of the 2 fully parametric middle bands, you can hold down the Alt key and drag up and down to change the bandwidth, or Q dial. As default, if you click on a new track, you'll see it switches the display to that track, because the Follow Selection box is checked. But there are a few different options here. I can also use the drop-down menu to choose one of the tracks, without even having to go to the mixer at all, which is really handy. So you can see I'm EQing the main synth fairly heavily to create a more distinctive sound. If I drag the EQ window over to Subtractor now, you can see even more advantages of having this analyzer. I'll turn the EQ off for a moment, and then, if I bring the resonance amount down, you can see the effect the resonance has on the signal, really fattening it up and dramatically bringing up the levels of the frequencies around the cutoff. So this is a useful display to have when editing frequency-related controls on devices too. And you can then adjust frequency values on the EQ according to how the signal looks and sounds. In this case, I'm reducing the lower frequencies, boosting the most dominant ones in the lower middle area, but attenuating some of the loudest frequencies in the 1 to 3 kHz region. Then, the upper band, which I've set to bell mode, is increasing the brightness and clarity. Now, like we did a minute ago, I can bring in the bass and sub-bass parts underneath, But what I'll do is show you how it looks as well as sounds. To do this, I just choose Master Section as the signal to be displayed, and then make sure Follow Selection is off, after which I can solo those tracks too to bring them in. So this gives me a nice display of the whole mix, as well as individual tracks. Okay, now let's take a look at some more new features on Reason's mixer. First up though, I'm going to organise the session a bit more. So I'll select all my drum tracks and then colour them the same way. Earlier on the course, I showed you how to create a drums submix with Kong using the 14:2 mixer device in the rack. However, the Reason mixer has got a lot more flexible when it comes to routing possibilities, as it now allows you to create bus or auxiliary channels in an instant, for one or more tracks. So, for example, if I wanted to route all my drums to a single track on the mixer now, I can just select them all, and then choose Route to New Output Bus. Then we get all of those drum tracks routing to this new bus channel, instead of the master. This is a great time-saving feature, where you'd previously have had to do it manually yourself. If I flip the rack round, you can't actually see any of the cabling going on. And that's because all the routing is done using PLAN, which is Reason's internal routing system, that's used to route audio or mixed devices, and now bus devices as well, to the master channel. You can see this in the audio output box on the back of the devices in the rack, with all those drums now going to bus 1 rather than the master section, and then bus 1 going to the master section. So I can rename that bus Drums Bus if I want to. And you can also change the routing of tracks from the mixer too, using the new pop-up menu below each fader, as you can see. So now, I can process my drums together on this bus track to maybe add some compression to them all. First, I'll hit the dynamic sidechain switch in the filters section. So I can use the filters to roll off the bottom end in the compressor sidechain, so the kick doesn't make the compressor pump. Then, I'll use a fast-acting compressor and tweak the ratio and threshold until I'm seeing the right amount of gain reduction on the meter. Okay, that's sounding good. And now I can open up the new EQ display and make some changes to the spectral shape of my drums too. You can see that it's maybe a bit lacking in the middle region here. So I could bring up a wide band in that area to fill out the drums a bit more. Not going overboard of course, as this is where the main synth part sits. So you can hear what a difference this combined processing makes to the sound of the drums, helping to gel them together and beef up the mix. Another great new feature in Reason 7 is the ability to instantly create a parallel channel. You may have noticed that a fair few of Reason's new rack extensions, as well as Pulverizer, include a dry-wet dial, allowing you to create things like parallel compression, which is a popular technique I demonstrated in the vocal processing module, where the compressor is on a separate channel, like a send effect, so you can blend in an amount of the compressed sound with the uncompressed, to achieve a fuller effect without losing the punch. Not all effects have this ability though, so Propellerhead have included it as a feature on the mixer. It's really simple to use. Just bring up the menu on a track and then choose Create Parallel Channel. Then the signal is split onto another track. So we now have two independent duplicates of the drums mix on their own mixer channels. And if we flip the rack round, you can see that these are hardwired using the new parallel connections, which are going into the inputs on the new mix device. And these are pre rather than post outputs, so are entirely independent of the channel settings on the original bus, such as the level, EQ, compressor, and so on. So now I can add a compressor to the channel, like pulverizer, which isn't necessarily the best one to demonstrate, as like I said, it does have a dry-wet dial for onboard parallel compression. However, this is still just a single crossfader style control, rather than two independent level faders as the mixer gives you with this parallel channel. The nice thing about parallel compression is that you can set the compressor up quite heavily. And then just fade in a little of the signal to make a large difference to the sound, but without changing it too drastically at the same time. I've got another synth in the track now, which I'm triggering with the same MIDI clip as the main synth, so I can add some higher frequencies, spaciousness, and air to the mix. And also, so I can show you another feature on mix devices. Here's the pad on its own. It's got quite an interesting sound already, with the comb filters and chorus being used on the synth. What I'm going to do though is add a phaser, which will shape the sound a bit more. So this is a pretty blatant use of the effect. What I'll do is sync the rate first, and then change it so the frequency shift is happening across two bars. I'm going to open up the EQ display too, so you can see the signal, as it's good for demonstrating the effect the phaser is having if I bring the device in and out. What we're going to do now though is bring the width down, so it's not as drastic a frequency shift. And also bring the feedback down so the effect is a bit subtler. This is like bringing the resonance down on a filter. And now I'm going to sort the top and bottom out a bit. First, I'll add a high-pass filter to remove these unwanted sub-frequencies that I wouldn't have known were there if I hadn't seen them on the analyzer. And I'll use a high shelf to bring up the very top, as the phaser is lessening that a bit. And the other thing I want to demonstrate is the CV out connector on the back of the mix device. This allows you to connect the control voltage created by the compressor sidechain on a track to another channel or device, to create some synchronized modulation. So for example, if I take the CV out on the main synth track, which is being ducked by the kick, and connect it to the phaser's frequency mod input, then we'll get the phaser frequency jumping up every time the kick hits. I'll turn up the feedback for a second so it's easier to hear. Then I can use the modulation amount on the back to make the effect subtler if I want to. What I'm actually going to do though is to add spider to the rack and then invert the signal, as I want the phaser frequency to come down on each kick rather than jumping up. You can hear if I bring the CV modulation in and out, but the pad just gels that little bit better in the mix, as its frequencies move with the kick. So that's shown you some of the great new mixing features in Reason 7, which really take the software up a notch in terms of workflow and speed with which a professional sounding mix can be created. Check the module session if you want to take a closer look at anything I've done here, and hit me up on email or the forum if you have any questions. See you next time.